Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have everyone here to learn with Dr. Gafni today. If you are joining us on Zoom, I'm going to send around one more promotion to panelists. I recommend taking that as you can ask questions a little more directly, not have to ask permission to speak. And if you're joining us on Zoom, if you're joining us on Facebook, also welcome. This is the Quest for the Text, searching for the Bible's original words throughout the ages. We have the pleasure of learning today with Dr. Gafni. I believe this is the penultimate session of this class. And so we have this week and next week with him. If you have questions for Dr. Gafni during class, please feel welcome to ask them in the chat boxes, both on Zoom and on Facebook. They will both be monitored, or at breaks when Dr. Gafni breaks for questions. If you want to keep your camera on, that's great. We like seeing you. All I ask is if you're not actively speaking to mute yourself, as that can create some unwanted audio feedback. And with that, Dr. Gafni, it's a pleasure to learn with you today.
Thank you so much. It's very nice to see you all here. And we're almost getting to the end of this series. We have two more sessions, today's session and the final one. And I will share the screen so we get a sense where we're holding and what is still left for us to do. Okay, you see the screen, right? Okay, good. So let's briefly review what we've done and also discuss what still is left for us to do. So as I mentioned in the very beginning of our class, this class involves 3 B's. The first one involves the Bible itself, or biblical texts. The second one involves the battles over the Bible. And finally, we want to learn a little bit about biblical criticism in the realm of the text of the Bible, as far as it involves the study of the text of the Bible. So far, we mainly devoted our classes to the first B's. We spoke about the Bible, and we spoke about the battles over the biblical text. Or if you want to look at it at the outline, we will see, you can see we covered in the first session, in the first meeting, we spoke about text witnesses and textual versions of the Bible, physical copies, and this abstract idea of a textual version of the Bible. We spoke about the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, 2 important versions of the Bible, textual versions of the Bible. So that was the first B. Then we proceeded and we spoke about Christian, Muslim, and Jewish battles over the biblical text. We devoted 3 sessions for that theme. We spoke about Christian accusations that Jews have forged the Bible. We spoke about Islamic accusations that Jews have forged their text, the Tahrif. And finally, we discussed the way that Jews responded in the ways that Jews tried to defend their version of the Bible. What is left for us to do is essentially reach the third B and discuss a little bit the shift from traditional ways of viewing the text to the more critical approaches. So what we will do today, first we'll briefly define what is the difference between a traditional or a critical perspective when it comes to the text. And we'll try to trace the reasons or the conditions, the circumstances that led to this shift from more traditional to more critical observations of the text. And eventually we'll also try to think through and maybe discuss the question whether traditional people can accept any of those critical notions when it comes to the text. So what is the difference? A brief treatment of the question, what is the difference between tradition or criticism when it comes to the text? I think it would be a fair way of expressing this or explaining this would be that traditional people wish, desire to think that they have the original text as it was given to Moshe at Mount Sinai. Traditional people want to think that the text remained in its original form and shape, and it did not change over the course of time. Obviously, different religious communities might think that it's a different type of text. For Jews, it might be one type of text. For Christians, it might be a different type of text. For Jews, it might be the Masoretic text. For Christians, it's the Septuagint. Muslims have their take on the text. But traditional societies and traditional religions, people often think or desire to think that they have the original word of God as presented in the Bibles that we have in front of us. At the same time, what do critical scholars say? Critical scholars say, no way. We don't have the original book. The original book is gone, is lost. We don't really know what precisely the original text says. All we can do is come up and compare all the existing versions that we have nowadays, and perhaps try to reconstruct what could be somewhat similar or close to that original text. And at times, we might even suspect whether the original text is presented or is preserved in any of the existing texts. And sometimes we even need to reconstruct that text using our own speculations and not necessarily relying on a given text. So the gaps between the traditional way and the critical way are pretty big. And the question that we will try to explore is, when did people start abandoning this perhaps naive approach that the original text is still there, is still out there? When did people become more speculative and started doubting as to the authenticity of any given text? What were the circumstances that led to that shift? Today, our attention will be devoted mainly to the Christian world, and we will talk about three important factors that scholars probably would point to that paved the way to this critical notion, to the critical study of the biblical text. In the next session, next week, we will talk about the Jewish world, because as we shall see next week, Jews were not so happy with these developments, and they adopted the critical approach only much, much later. So today's class is essentially devoted to the Christian sphere, to the Christian world, and we will speak mainly about two factors, and if time will allow, we'll maybe say a few words of the remaining one. The first important factor that paved the way for this critical approach was the Protestant Reformation. So the first theme we will address a little bit more briefly, we will talk about the impact of the Reformation on the study of the biblical text, and in what ways did the Reformation lead to thinking about the text more critically. So that's going to be the first element of today's class. The second one is not so much a theological revolution, but rather a scientific discovery. We will talk about the discovery of the Samaritan version of the Bible, and we will see how that also contributed in its own way for critical approaches towards the biblical text. And as I said, if time will allow, maybe we'll say one word about the emergence of modern universities in Europe and how they also had their share in making people think more critically of the text. So we're starting. The first part of today's class is about the Protestant Reformation and its impact on the study of the biblical text. So what are we going to say? We don't have time to review or survey the entire story of the Reformation, and we'll do it very, very briefly. We will talk very briefly about the historical background of the Protestant Reformation. We'll speak about the hero, Martin Luther. We'll talk about one of the important principles that he comes up with, essentially sola scriptura. We'll talk about the Protestant version of the Bible, or the Protestant Bible. And finally, we'll talk about the impact of that on the study of the biblical text. So those are the things we're going to talk about when dealing with the first element, the Protestant Reformation. This is not a historical class, and obviously there's a lot more to say. We're trying to talk about it in very brief terms and focus on the element that on the impact or relevance of this revolution, theological revolution, on the study of the Bible. We'll do it with illustrations. It's easier with rather than too many words, so we'll focus mainly on pictures. So what led to the Protestant Reformation? The biggest split in the Christian world, perhaps, from its very start. Scholars point to two main factors that probably paved the way for this big shift or this big split in the history of the Christian church. The first one is the corruption in the Christian world. If you lived in the medieval period, you really needed to use or rely on various services of the Christian church throughout your life, from the moment you were born, through the school where you went to, or if you were sick, if you went to a hospital, it was all run by the church, getting married, up to the last point, up to your death. Throughout your life, you're really relying on the Christian church. However, despite the fact that the Christian church was preaching for simple life, for leading very humble society. But at the same time, the Christian church was really very much corrupt. A lot of money was accumulated by the church, and the most extreme aspect of that was those bills that the Christian church was used to sell in order to have people's sins be for repentance. So your sins will be taken away. These are those bills. This is a typical bill, and here you see an illustration of some representatives of the church selling these bills. So that is perceived as the most extreme way in which this corruption was taking place. We also need to take into account the very complicated connection between, or relationship between, the Christian church and the secular government. In this, taking in this background into mind, we can understand that something had to take place. Somebody has to shake in this whole system, and the person who's associated, who's the hero of this Reformation, is Martin Luther. You see his years, 1483 to 1546. He was born in a fairly poor family. He started studying law in the University of Erfurt in Germany, but for one reason or another, whether it's because he was struck by thunder or for other reasons, he decides to devote his life to Christianity. He wants to become a priest, and shortly after, in 1507, shortly after he shifts from his law school to this monastery where he's studying Christianity, he becomes a priest. And from then on, he's going to be more and more upset with what he sees. In 1510, he travels to Rome, and that's where he is really exposed to what he felt, the corruptness of the Christian church. And from then on, he's introducing his ideas how things need to improve. In 1597, he posts his 95 Theses, and later on, in 1530, we can already talk about a split in the Christian church between the Catholics, literally the universal church, or the people who protest, the Protestants, led by Martin Luther. Why is all of this relevant for us? Martin Luther's main message, or one of his important messages, is that we need to go back to some more simple, pure version of Christianity that would not rely so heavily on the institution, on the Christian church as an institution. For this purpose, he comes up with his 5 solas. Sola means alone, so 5 alones. Here you have them both in Latin and in English above. So it's sola scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia, solus Christus, and soli Deo gloria. So we'll start with the second one because our main interest will be the first one. I'll just say a brief word on each one of the other ones. Sola fide means by faith alone, meaning in order to be redeemed or saved, all you need is to believe in the right things, believe in God, believe in Jesus, and not give any money to any institution or any person. You don't need people to tell you that your sins are forgiven. It's just by faith alone. Sola gratia means by grace alone. You don't deserve to have your sins being forgiven. It's only because God, grace, is that you are able to be redeemed. Solus Christus emphasizes the role of Jesus in that process. And soli Deo gloria means glory is only to God, again, and not to anybody else. But where our main concern is not those last 4 solas, but rather the first one. The first sola is called sola scriptura, which means by scripture alone. So what did Luther, when he introduces this idea, what is he saying by that? So there's, again, a lot of literature on each one of those elements, but we're just going to say it very, very briefly. What Martin Luther felt at his time is that simple people didn't really have any access to the Bible on their own. Most people in Europe at his time didn't know how to read and write. And even if they were, and the only way they were able to be exposed to the Bible was by visiting the church, maybe on Sunday, and hearing the priest tell them the stories of the Bible. But even the priest himself didn't necessarily know the stories that well. And he was combining his stories with all sorts of traditions and interpretation that accumulated in the course of centuries. It's a little bit similar to the way that sometimes kids come from the kindergarten in Jewish context, and they tell you the stories of the Chumash with all the Agadot of Chazal. And they don't really distinguish between what the text says and what later midrashim or interpretations were added later on. This is a little bit what was going on there too. People heard the Tanakh, the Bible, with all sorts of Christian interpretations and elaborations, but the original text was kind of lost. What Luther felt is, we don't need to have people tell us what the text says. We're supposed to have people be able to read the text, understand it by themselves and interpret it by themselves. So what were the implications? That's the essence of sola scriptura, by scripture alone, and not through the institution, and not using or relying on all these means of understanding what the text is saying. So what were the implications of this sola scriptura's business? The first one involved translating the Bible. If people couldn't read the Bible before Luther's time, because there were no translations of the Bible in spoken languages, the only ways that people were able to read the Bible was either they knew Greek in the Septuagint, or if they knew Latin. Translations of the Bible were very uncommon. They did exist, but certainly did not circulate around. And people were not able to read the text because they just didn't even know the language, whether Greek or Latin. So the first thing Martin Luther decides, he will translate the Bible into a spoken language. In his case, into German. So now any person who speaks the language can read the text. He doesn't need to hear the priest read it for him. He can read the text himself. The second implication was dealing with the interpretation. You don't need to rely on the midrash, in the Christian case, the authoritative interpretation of the church fathers when you want to read the text. You can just rely on your own insights, independent interpretation of the Bible, not relying on church fathers' traditional interpretation. What you understand in the text has its own value or its own importance. Whatever you hear, whatever you sense, is already something very significant. Again, get rid of the institution, of the tradition, and move back to something much more simple and original, authentic. So these are two important things, translation and interpretation. But for our purposes, perhaps the most important thing is not about the translation, but in the interpretation, but rather the examination of the biblical text. Luther, when he translates the Bible, has to make a very basic decision from the very beginning. What text is he going to translate? Is he going to use the Vulgate as basis for his translation? Is he going to use the Septuagint? What is he going to use? In a rather surprising manner, Luther makes a very daring decision. He claims, I will only translate the text from its original language, from Hebrew. I will rely on the Masoretic text as basis for my translation. And it kind of makes sense from his perspective. He felt, if I want to go as close as possible to the original and get rid of anything in between, it shouldn't be just a matter of what interpretation, it also has to do with the very basic text. He felt that the original language in which the text was preserved in Hebrew must be more reliable, and therefore I should move back to the original Hebrew. Side point we need to emphasize, this feeling or this instinct of his is not necessarily accurate, because the Septuagint is not a translation of the Masoretic text. It's a different version of the Bible that might have preserved original reading in a form of translation. Masoretic text and Septuagint is not just original versus translation. These are two independent textual versions of the text. But Luther felt that he should prefer the original Hebrew over any translation of the Bible. And this has very significant impact on the study of the Bible, and specifically on the study of the biblical text. Here you see the 1534 German translation of Luther. This is an original copy. You see it says on it in German letters, Biblia, das ist die ganze heilige Schrift, Deutsch. So Bible, that is the entire Holy Scripture in Deutsch. Then later on you see Martin Luther, which is his name, Martin Luther, Wittenberg. That's the place where it was published. And finally on the bottom you see the year, 1534. The other part is about the place where it was actually printed. So this is the copy of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. He produced a translation of the New Testament as well, but that's not of our concern. And as I said to you before, he's deciding to follow the Masoretic text over any competing version of the Bible. Well, if we want to be more specific, this is something very dramatic in two ways. The first thing, if you recall, there's a difference in terms of the scope or the size of the canon. The Masoretic text is a much smaller canon or version of the Bible. It only contains 24 books, whereas the Septuagint includes more books, the Apocrypha. So the first implication or outcome of this decision to adopt the Masoretic text rather than the Septuagint meant that he was basically given away the role or the importance or the value of a few compositions that were perceived by many Christians as part of the Bible. As a matter of fact, you can see here, this is the first page of the book itself. And he says there, he did include the Apocrypha or these texts in his original version of the Bible, but he emphasizes Apocrypha, I'm translating this into English, these books are not held equal to Scripture, but are useful and good to read. You can see this in the German letters, Apocrypha, das sind Bücher, so nicht der Heiligen Schrift gleich gehalten, und doch nützlich und gut zu lesen sind. So they're good for reading, you can enjoy them, but they're not part of the real hardcore Bible. And here you see the list of the books, Judith, Tuvia, Baruch, Maccabees, all these books are part of the Apocrypha. Judith is the book of Hanukkah. If you remember, some communities read the book of Judith during Hanukkah, but he's saying these are nice books to read. You might enjoy them. They might be providing you with useful ideas, but they're not part of the Bible. That's in terms of the scope of the entire corpus of the canon. But he's also saying that when it comes to the even books that are included in the canon, he will follow the Masoretic text. He will not follow the Septuagint or the Vulgate. If we had more time, I would be demonstrating a few verses from his translation. You will see that consistently he's following Masoretic text and preferring Masoretic text over competing versions. For instance, you remember we spoke about the verse in Genesis, "Vayichal Elohim bayom hashvi'i melachto asher asa, vayishbot bayom hashvi'i." We saw Masoretic text, Shvi'i and Shvi'i. Septuagint, on the other hand, says, it would translate Vayichal Elohim bayom hashishi, God completing the work on the sixth day and concluded on the seventh day. So he would follow the Masoretic text, just the way we have it. God completed his work on the seventh day and rested on the seventh day as well. So he's consistently with the Masoretic text. Only rarely, when it has clear Christian implications or impact, he would still maintain the Septuagint or the Vulgate. This makes a huge revolution, and it shakens the entire study or the world of the study of the Bible. Because from now on, there's suddenly a big impulse for people to start studying the Bible and comparing the Septuagint to the Masoretic text. Beyond that, it leads to a major battle between Catholics and Protestants. Which version of the Bible should we prefer? Should we follow the Masoretic text? That's what Protestants are saying. Or should we still be loyal to our Septuagint or to the Vulgate that we're familiar with? And scholars are now comparing those systematically. As expected, Protestants initially say it's only one thing. They're thinking still traditionally. It's only the Masoretic text. And Catholics are saying, no, we should rely on our tradition, on the Septuagint. But as time goes by, in the course of 100 years or 150 years, people will realize more and more that perhaps the truth is not to be found entirely in one side, but that, at least that's what scholars felt then, that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. That sometimes perhaps we should prefer the Masoretic text, but in other occasions, there is room also to prefer the Septuagint. So the truth was not already found to be found in one place or another. This traditional naive thinking that there's one version that is entirely perfect and pure and original was already no longer the prevailing version of the text. Yes, Yael.
Ken, you're talking about the Masoretic text and versus the Septuagint, but I thought that the Christian Bible, the New Testament, was written in Koine Greek. And there are parts of it in Hebrew, but that most of it isn't in Hebrew. So the
So all we're
Masoretic
talking
text
about now,
is referring to the Jewish Bible, the Old
right? So
Testament.
everything we're talking about now is about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Our course is not designated to the New Testament. I'm talking about the study of the Old Testament. The translation that I was referring to here is of the translation of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And here, there was an option between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint or the Vulgate, and he prefers the Masoretic text over any other competing version of the Bible. That gave a new impulse to the study of the Bible, to comparing all these versions. And in the course of 100 years or 150 years, the naive approach that one version is perfect and the other ones are just distorted and corrupt lost its dominance, and people suddenly understood that if you want to think about this in a critical manner, you just have to compare all the versions verse by verse. Sometimes you might prefer one, but in other cases you might prefer the other. So that's one important cause or reason why people started thinking critically. But I really want to devote most of our class today, we don't have so much more time left, to another important discovery that also comes or appears in the same time frame, and that is the discovery of the Samaritan version of the Bible. And we'll talk about the Samaritans. Who are the Samaritans briefly? We'll talk about the Samaritan sites, holy sites, and the Samaritan Pentateuch as an introduction. We'll talk about the book of Abishai. We'll introduce that book as well. And then we'll talk about the discovery of the Samaritan version of the Bible in the beginning of the 17th century and the impact of that discovery on the study of the biblical text. So far we spoke about the Reformation, and now we're going to move one step forward and talk about another version of the Bible. This is a big day today. We're learning about a new version of the Bible, and in addition, another main factor that helped people think more critically about the text itself. So we'll start step by step. Who are the Samaritans? I did not write who were the Samaritans, but rather who are the Samaritans, because they're still out there. So who are the Samaritans? To answer that question, you have to tell, the best way to answer this question is depends who you ask. There's no one answer to who are the Samaritans, but it very much depends on who do you approach and ask. So we'll start with the Jewish approach, the Jewish traditional approach as to the origins of the Samaritan, and that is found in Sefer Melachim, the book of Kings 2, chapter 17, and we're going to read 4 verses from there. And this is what the text is saying. And the king of Assyria, Ashur, brought people from Babylon, Kuta, Ava, Hamat, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria, instead of the people of Israel, and they took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. So from the Jewish perspective, the king of Assyria, after conquering portions of the northern part of the land of Israel, is trying to exchange populations. So whereas the northern tribes of the Jews, of the Israelites, are being deported out of the country, the king of Assyria is bringing foreign elements from all sorts of places to settle in the land of Israel. And I'm going on, at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord, they don't fear God, the local God. Therefore the Lord sent lions amongst them, which kills some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, the nations that you have carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land, of the local God. Therefore this God, he had sent lions among them. And behold, they are killing them because they do not know the law of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the priests of the Israeli priests whom you carried away from there, and let him go and dwell there and teach them the law of the God of the land. So this is the Jewish narrative. What is the story of the Samaritans? So from the Jewish perspective, the Samaritan community is not an originally Israeli community. They're actually foreigners. And for that reason, in Jewish tradition, many times people don't refer to them as Samaritans or Shombonim, but rather what's the nickname that they're given to by the rabbis? Either they're called Kutim, implying that they come from far away, they come from the city of Kuta, somewhere far away, or another nasty title that Jews sometimes call them, they often refer to them as geirei arayot, converts of lions, right? This is from the web, I found this, implying that they didn't really convert to God, to Judaism or to the Israeli religion out of conviction, out of sincere conviction, but rather because they were nervous of those lions that were eating them up. So either Kutim or Gerei Arayot, but not original Jews. This is what you would hear if you ask the Jews or Jewish sources about the origin of the Samaritan community. The Samaritans themselves have a very, very different explanation where they come from. And this is taken from some Samaritan website that still is on the web. And this is what it would tell you. The Samaritans, for their part, consider themselves an integral part of the Jewish people. We endured the Egyptian exile as one people, followed Moses through the desert together, and together conquered the land of Canaan under Joshua's leadership. So this is what they believe. We're integral part of the Jewish people. The Samaritans claim to be descended from the tribes of Joseph, Ephraim, and Menashe, and define them, their priests, as descendants of the original Levites. So they're not claiming that we're foreigners, we're strangers. We are the only people who actually are rooted in the land, in the Jewish people, or in the Israeli of Israel, that never left the country. We're the only ones that remained in the country throughout, from the moment we entered the land of Israel to the current moment. Here we can skip a little bit. We don't need to read the entire passage here. What's crucial for us is, again, that they say, they imply that while Jews are descendants of exiles from the southern kingdom of Judah, they themselves are remnants of the northern Israeli kingdom, and they claim that they stayed here and never left the land. Samaritans do not call themselves Kutim or Gerei Arayot. They're not from Kuta, and they're not converts of lions. They're Shomronim. They're local people, residents of Samaria that never left the land. In addition to this question as where their origin is, the most important difference between the Israelites or the Jews and the Samaritans involves the place of worship. And here too, there are different records. From the Jewish, and here we'll start with the Samaritan version of this thing. In the Samaritan version, according to the Samaritan version, the holiest place is called Mount Gerizim, that is close to the city of Shechem, to Nablus. Here you see a map, you see here Shechem in Samaria, and below that on the south, there's Har Gerizim. From their perspective, all the important historical events took place there. That's where Adam dwelled and built and Noah built his altar there. That's where the binding of Isaac was. Everything happened in Mount Gerizim. There's 12 stones erected by Joshua were there. Everything took place in Mount Gerizim, and they even have this requirement that each person must be visited by the believers every year. Even nowadays, the Samaritans still have to bring their offerings of the Pesach, Korban Pesach, Passover sacrifice is still being sacrificed on the mountain of Har Gerizim. The Jewish have, on the other hand, a very different story that involves the Samaritans. From the Jewish perspective, the Samaritans didn't really believe in Mount Gerizim from the very beginning. From their perspective, the Samaritans wished to join the Israelites when they come back from Babylon and take part in the establishment of the temple in Jerusalem. From the Jewish perspective, this is relying on the text from the book of Ezra. So this is what it says. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, so when people, the opponents of Judah and Benjamin, hear that the Jews are reestablishing their temple, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. And we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Asarhaddon, the king of Assyria, who brought us here." So from the Jewish perspective, this text is alluding to the Samaritans because they're saying, we also believe in the same God since the king of Assyria has brought us here. So it seems to be speaking about this community. However, from the Jewish perspective, the Samaritans are being rejected by the Jewish community. But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel said to them, You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God. But we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. From the Jewish perspective, the Samaritans desired to be part of the temple in Jerusalem, but since they were rejected, they only chose Mount Gerizim as a second best option. So this is again a very big difference between the approaches of these two communities. Finally, and this is where things become more important for our discussion, the Samaritans also have their own version of the Bible. So far we learned about two important texts. We spoke about the Masoretic text and we spoke about the Septuagint. And now we need to introduce ourselves with the third most crucial, most important version of the Bible, which is the Samaritan version of the Bible. And we will try to characterize it, learn a little bit about it, and then try to see what was the impact of this text and the discovery of this text on the study of the Hebrew Bible. So the questions we will want to address is the scope, how many books are included in the Samaritan version of the Bible, how are they divided, what's their order, the same questions we asked when we dealt with the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. In what language are they written? What's their script? What do we know about the pronunciation, syntax, about the content, and about the context in which this text emerges? So we'll do it step by step. We'll start with the scope. As you can see in the title of this page, the Samaritans don't have a full corpus. They only have the five books of Moses. The Samaritans have just the Pentateuch. From their perspective, all these descriptions I just read to you from the book of Kings or from the book of Ezra, mocking them is not part of their Bible. They only have the five books of Moses. At some point in the medieval period, some representatives of the Samaritan community wrote an alternative book of Joshua, trying to cover the historical period from the time that the Jews, the Israelites, entered the land of Israel up to the point where Alexander the Great conquers the land of Israel. So they have their own narrative or their own version of what happened since they entered the land of Israel, but that is not perceived, even though it's called the book of Joshua, it's really an alternative narrative and they don't perceive it as part of their Bible. So if you're strictly speaking, Samaritans only have the five books of Moses. That being the case, we do not need to talk about the division. How did they divide their Bible into Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, like the Jews, or by genres like the Septuagint does? They only have the book, the legal part of the Bible, the Torah. Also, the order is something we don't need to discuss. What's the sequence of the books? They follow the same sequence: Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Dvarim. What about the language and the script? In terms of the language, just like the Masoretic text, so does the Samaritan text use the original language of the book. Before we get into the question what language it is, it's important to emphasize they work with the original language, which happens to be Hebrew. So the Samaritan text is not a translation of the Bible. It's a version of the Bible, a textual version of the Bible that is kept in the original language in Hebrew. However, so in that sense, it's similar to the Masoretic text and different than the Septuagint, which is just a translation of some textual version of the Bible. What about the script? So here, the Samaritan text has some advantage, if we can call it that way, over the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text that we are familiar with uses the Assyrian script. It's some form or font of the alphabet that was adopted by Jews only during the time of the Babylonian exile. It's influenced by some Assyrian or Syrian type of alphabet. A later development of the shapes of the fonts of the different letters. The Samaritans have the same 22 letters, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, but they're written in a more original or more primitive state of their development. This is in Hebrew, it's called the Proto-Canaanite, or something that resembles the Proto-Canaanite, or in Hebrew, sometimes people refer to it as Haktav Ha'ivri HaKadum, the ancient form of the Hebrew alphabet. This type of script is found even nowadays in some inscriptions that belong to the biblical period, pre-Babylonian exile, before the Babylonian exile, not precisely the same, but it resembles the same type of script. So Samaritans don't just use the original language, but they seem to be using something that resembles the original type of script as well. They do not have end letters as far as I remember. They only have the 22 letters without the end letters of Mem and Nun and Tzadik and Pei and Kaf, the way that we are familiar with. In addition, we need to talk about the pronunciation and the syntax. Samaritans do not have vowels and accents, not just in their formal text that they read in the synagogue. They would avoid using the vowels and accents in any context when they're reading the Bible. So how do they know how to read it? Just like we know how to read a book without vowels and accents in other cases. They have a tradition and they can tell by the context how words are supposed to be pronounced. So they have their own tradition how to read the text. However, we need to emphasize that sometimes their pronunciation is different than the way that we're familiar with. It's partly a result of the way that they pronounce certain letters. They might sound out letters a little bit differently, but in some cases, it's just a different tradition. I'm just making up. They might read the word Bereshit as Bara Ashayata because they have a different tradition. So it's not just how they sound out certain letters, it's also alternative traditions, how certain words were pronounced. In similar manner, we can add, the Samaritans do not have the te'amim, the accents that we're using. They have their own tradition, how they know how to, what the syntax of the text, which is not presented in any visual manner. They don't have nikud and they don't have te'amim. It's a tradition that they keep orally, and it's not always similar to the one that people use in the Masoretic text. The most crucial difference for us, obviously, is not about these technical aspects, but also in terms of the content itself. The Samaritan text is drastically different than both the Masoretic text and also of the Septuagint. What type of differences distinguish between the Samaritan text and the Masoretic text? So we can talk about two types of differences. Some of the differences we can call or describe as neutral differences. Differences that have nothing to do with the Samaritan religion and unique beliefs. It's just differences, technical differences. If we wanted to characterize some of these differences, we can say two things. The first thing is that the Samaritan version of the Bible tends to appear more consistent. Texts that repeat themselves twice in the Bible will be spelled in the same manner or will be formulated in a systematic manner. To give you one example, in the Ten Commandments, the commandment of Shabbat appears twice in the Torah, both in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, Parashat Yitro and Parashat Va'etchanan. In the Masoretic text, one starts with the word Zachor, and the other starts with the word Shamor. Right? We have two versions. That's what we say, Zachor v'Shamor b'dibur echad. It appears in two different formulations. The Samaritan text will be consistent. It will use the word Zachor both places. So that's one tendency you can find there. Words or texts that repeat themselves twice will tend to be more consistent. Another feature of the Samaritan text is somewhat tendency to write words in a fuller manner with more letters like Vav and Yud. That could be a result of the fact that they did not use vowels and accents, and therefore they tried to make up for that by adding more letters that help a person know how to pronounce certain words. In any event, those are neutral or technical differences. However, in some cases, there are differences that are also involving theological importance. Differences that are not just neutral differences, but ideological differences. Perhaps the most extreme example of that is a full commandment. As part of the commandments from Mount Sinai, there's a full commandment to establish or to build an altar on Mount Gerizim. After we record all of the commandments, there's an additional commandment to have an altar, to build an altar or a monument on Mount Gerizim. You might ask me, if that's the case, so how do they have 10 commandments? They should have 11 commandments. So I should ask you back, and who says we have 10 commandments? Maybe we have 11 commandments. So the answer is no, that's not possible, because in Deuteronomy, it says Aseret HaDvarim. So there are 10 commandments in the Bible. So you can't just add more commandments. So what did the Samaritans do? Samaritans probably tend to assume that Anochi Hashem Elohecha, the first commandment, is not really a commandment. It's more like an assumption or a starting point, because if you don't believe in God, why bother obeying the rest of the commandments? So from their perspective, it's a form of introduction, and then you have the remaining 10 commandments. This is not a technical difference. It's not just something that involves some technical feature, consistency or full and the tendency to write things in a more full manner. This is an ideological difference. Samaritan text emphasizes the role of Mount Gerizim. Also in other verses in Deuteronomy, you will find in other places where the words Har Eival are altered by the words Mount Gerizim. Here you see, here I'll show you one example. So this is from the book of Deuteronomy. This is one of the versions of one of the editions of the Samaritan text. You see here that it compares the Masoretic text on the right-hand side with the vowels to the Samaritan text on the left-hand side. So some differences are technical. You see the word Heitev in Masoretic text has 2 yuds here. But so this is a technical difference. But switching Har Eival to Har Gerizim is already not something technical. You see, in English, it would read, we have in the Masoretic text, and when you have crossed the Jordan, you shall set up these stones concerning which I command you today on Mount Eival, and you shall plaster them with plaster. So this is how it appears in the Masoretic text, but in the Samaritan version, it will have Har Gerizim. So far, we just described this version of the Bible, not saying anything about its importance or value. Before we proceed, I just need to say one more interesting thing, something about the text witnesses of the Samaritan version. Text witness, I'm reminding you, physical copies of that version of the Bible. So what is the most important physical copy of this version of the Bible that we have nowadays? So there's a book called the Book of Avisha, Sefer Avisha. Sefer Avisha is a very ancient copy of the Samaritan text, of the Samaritan Pentateuch. Who wrote this text? When is it from? Again, depends who you ask. If you will ask, and I may add, naive, very traditional Samaritans, they argue that the Book of Avisha was composed or was written physically at the time of Joshua. That's what they argue. The name of the scribe appears at the end of the book in the colophon, the signature of the scribe, and they argue, at least naive Samaritans argue, that they have a copy of the Bible that was written physically from the time of Joshua. However, this approach is not accepted by most scholars. Yitzchak ben Tzvi, the president of the state of Israel, visited the Samaritan community, was very, very involved in their history, and he examined the books, and he claims that it's probably 12th or 13th century CE. Still very precious, still very valuable, but not as ancient as they argue. The parchment is done in a very different way, and the letters appear a little bit different, but this is still a very ancient copy of the Bible. It doesn't mean that their version of the Bible is not ancient. It just means that the physical copy that we have that survived, it comes from a later period. Just like the Aleppo Codex is from the beginning of the 10th century. Doesn't mean that that's when the Masoretic text was constituted or shaped. It just means that this is the physical copy that survived from that period. Why is all of this important? People were not familiar with the Samaritan text for many, many centuries. They knew that there were Samaritan people out there, but people in Europe or throughout many, many areas in Europe barely knew anything about the Samaritans up to the 16th century, up to the 17th century. They knew of their existence. Jews heard of the Samaritans through Jewish literature. They knew that there are people called Kutim or Gerei Arayot in rabbinic literature. They had a lot more information about this sect. But Europeans didn't know so much about their version of the Bible and about the nature of this community. It's only in modern times, in the 16th and 17th century, that the Samaritans become more known in European territories. And this is where we reach almost the last thing I want to discuss today, and that is the discovery of the Samaritan Bible. An important or interesting figure in Italy named Pietro della Valle was the person who brought, perhaps for the first time, a Samaritan copy of the Bible from somewhere in the Middle East to Europe. Here you see it below. I wrote here, the Samaritan Pentateuch first became known in the West through manuscripts secured in Damascus in 1616 by Pietro della Valle, an Italian traveler. Pietro della Valle is a very amusing figure, very interesting character. A lot of stories were told about him. According to some traditions, he was almost deciding to commit suicide, and somebody suggested, rather than killing yourself, perhaps you want to take a journey in the Middle East and explore all sorts of countries, purchase things along your way. And that's what he does. He travels in various areas, in Israel, in Syria, in Egypt, and his boxes are starting to be filled with all sorts of documents that he's collecting everywhere. One of the things he purchases along the way is a copy of the Samaritan Pentateuch. He himself was not a scholar, and he didn't really know what to make of this discovery, but he brings this along with many other awkward things. If you look online, you can read about more things that he brought along the way. Really weird, awkward, scary sometimes. But one of the things he purchased was a copy of the Samaritan text. And he brings this to Europe, and he has all sorts of scholars take a look at this. This, you have to remember, was brought to Europe at the midst of this debate between Catholics and Protestants as to what is the original version of the Bible. Catholics maintained it's the Septuagint. The Protestants were arguing that the Masoretic text is a better representation of the text. And here comes this Pietro della Valle with an alternative version of the Bible. People were fascinated by this discovery and immediately tried to investigate and try to get a sense, who is this supporting, the Protestant or the Catholics? And I want you to tell me, just to take a guess, who would be pleased with this discovery, Protestants or Catholics?
Protestants.
Another try. Sorry. It was actually Catholics who were very pleased with this discovery for this simple reason. For many, many centuries, for a century now, 100 years, Protestants were arguing the Hebrew text is more reliable. It was written in Hebrew in the original language, and we must trust that over any competing text. However, now this Pietro della Valle comes with a new copy of the Bible in the original Hebrew, with even an original script, and it does not follow the Masoretic texts. It's an alternative version of the Bible. Catholics couldn't be happier. They were insisting, here we have clear evidence that the fact that Jews have a Hebrew version of the Bible does not necessarily mean that their version is more reliable or is more accurate. Here we find a competing version of the Bible that does not follow their tradition. And we need to add a few more important elements to understand this. The first thing is that in some cases, the Septuagint was supported, the textual version of the Septuagint was supported by various readings that were found also in the Samaritan text. I gave you one example. Vayichal Elohim bayom. In the Septuagint, it's Vayichal Elohim bayom hashishi melachto asher asa. God completed his work on the sixth day. In the Masoretic text, Vayichal Elohim bayom hashvi'i, God completing his work on the seventh day. The Samaritan goes along with the Septuagint, not with the Masoretic text. So Catholics were very happy, very pleased to find an alternative original Hebrew that does not follow the Masoretic text, and at the same time that supports some of the Septuagint readings. In addition to that, we need to remember that the Samaritan text seems to be more consistent. Initially, people thought that that is a sign of being more authentic. Consistent text must be more authentic. Why have Zachor one place and Shamor in another place? Wouldn't it be more natural to assume that the same text is going to be consistent throughout? So that too led people think the Samaritan text is more reliable than the Masoretic text. And this original form of original script also impressed people very much. But this celebration by Catholics did not last for too long. Here you see, this is one of the people who published the Samaritan Pentateuch. His name was Jan Morin, a French priest, and he's one of the first people who published this in his polyglot, this multi-language version of the Bible. And he was a Catholic, and as I said here, initially he was very much happy with this discovery. So you see, he formed a very exaggerated view of the value of the Samaritan tradition of the text. And he says here, colored by polemical bias against Protestantism. So initially it was considered as a Catholic proof that the Masoretic text is not reliable. But this celebration did not last for too long, because shortly afterwards, people understood, just as the Samaritan text is different than the Masoretic text, it's also very different than the Septuagint. It has its own unique readings. And sometimes the Masoretic text follows the Samaritan text and the Septuagint remains alone. In addition, people felt that the consistency of the Samaritan text is not necessarily proving its authenticity. Consistency might be an attempt to correct or to improve an original text that is not as consistent as as the Samaritan version is. So all these things that impressed people initially were kind of calmed down after a few years. And this again led people realize, not immediately, but after a short time, that there's no ideal version of the Bible. What we need to do is keep comparing and reviewing all the versions of the Bible. And only when you compare all three versions and you think through what would be the original, what sounds as the most convincing reading of the text, we can determine what we should establish our version of the Bible. And perhaps in some cases, it doesn't exist in any of the three versions of the Bible, because once you lose your trust in any given text, you start speculating that maybe in some cases we don't have that original version in any form or shape, in any of those three leading versions of the Bible. So what we've done today, we spoke about two very important elements or factors that paved the way for critical study of the Bible. The first one is the Protestant Reformation, this battle between Catholics and Protestants, Masoretic text versus Septuagint, leading or making people become eventually more speculative as right or wrong, but right or wrong in this realm. Later on, another version of the Bible, the Samaritan text, that makes its way also to the headlines, initially supporting the Catholic view that we should not rely on the Masoretic text, but eventually making people become less sure about themselves and less convinced that we have one perfect, ideal version of the Bible. All these contributions were very visible in the way that people start studying the Bible in academic circles. And I'll just say one word about this before we end. Starting from universities emerged already very early on in the medieval period. 11th, 12th century, we already have universities in Germany, in France, but universities change their shape and nature very much as time goes by, and they become less religious or less radical in their religious approaches as time goes by. They become much more liberal or open-minded in the time of enlightenment. All these discoveries become very evident in university settings. So whereas in churches, people might still be traditional in their way of treatment of the Bible, in university settings, people became more and more liberal. People became more open-minded or speculative as to whether we have this ideal perfect version of the Bible. What we need to do now, so we concluded one important step, the study of the Bible, the rise of critical approaches to in the study of the biblical text. What is left for us for next week is to see what happens in the Jewish world. Did Jews also become critical? When did that happen? And we'll also conclude next week by talking about the way that people can combine critical and traditional thinking about that text. Can traditional people accept any of these new insights on the Bible? So this is what's going to be left for us for next week. If time will allow us, I don't know how much time we'll have, we'll try to do also a brief review over everything we've done. So it's not just going to be continuing, but also some sort of summary about the different versions of the Bible, about the different battles over the Bible, and about the rise and the circumstances that led into more critical ways of treating the biblical text. And that is the end for today's class. We covered a lot of stuff. Usually I do this in 2 sessions, but I try to squeeze it so we can conclude at least something in the course of this 7-session unit. Okay, thank you so much.
Come on, come on.
Thank you. That was quite amazing.
Would you please
Thank
let me unmute? No.
Okay.
So these are not the
Jesus
Karaites.
Christ.
What's the
This-
question?
The Shomronim are not the Karaites.
No.
Right.
The Karaites are a different group of people. They emerge much later, maybe in the 10th, 7th, 8th, 9th century, a whole different sect.
Right.
It's
Do they use?
post-biblical.
Do
Yeah.
they use the? But do they use the Shomroni Bible?
No. As a matter of fact, the Karaites had contributed a lot in establishing the Masoretic text. They were very much involved in establishing what became the common version of the Bible among rabbis as well. But they're a theme for another course. Talking about the Karaites is a whole new story. The Samaritans and the Karaites are different groups. The Karaites have the entire version of the Bible as well. They don't believe only in the 5 books of Moses. They have the entire Bible. What they emphasize is the way we need to interpret the Bible, not so much about the text, but the interpretation. Okay? That's a theme for another class. There's so much to study. Okay, this is just a glimpse of some stuff. Okay, bye-bye. Hope to see you next week.